Le 27 janvier 1945, l'armée rouge libérait le camp d'extermination d'Auschwitz en Pologne. C'est cette date qui a depuis été retenue pour marquer chaque année la commémoration de la Shoah. Ces 6 millions de victimes juives, donner la parole à des rescapés qui sont de moins en moins nombreux chaque année. Et puis également permettre à des personnalités de premier plan de s'exprimer sur le thème de la mémoire de la Shoah et de la lutte contre l'antisémitisme. C'est ce que nous allons faire aujourd'hui dans cette émission proposée par le Congrès juif européen et à laquelle s'associe également i24 News. C'est parti. Alors, première personnalité qui va prendre la parole au cours de cette émission spéciale, eh bien, c'est le président de la République française, Emmanuel Macron. Je vous propose de l'écouter.
Bonjour à toutes et tous. Je vous remercie pour cette invitation à ouvrir cet événement organisé par le Congrès juif européen. En cette veille de la journée internationale de commémoration des victimes de la Shoah, je souhaite m'associer à vous pour ce moment de recueillement, de parole, d'échange. La parole contre l'oubli, le devoir de transmettre est le sens même de ces mots de Simone Veil. Je la cite. « Nous, les derniers survivants, nous avons le droit et même le devoir de vous mettre en garde et de vous demander que le plus jamais ça de nos camarades devienne réalité. Pour rester fidèles à la promesse faite à ces survivants, il nous faut non seulement continuer sans relâche à faire vivre la mémoire des victimes, en particulier lorsque certains tentent de la falsifier, mais il nous faut aussi continuer à agir très concrètement, au quotidien, sans relâche là aussi. Je sais chacun d'entre vous pleinement engagé dans ce travail de mémoire et ce travail pour combattre les actes comme les propos antisémites. Soyez assurés que la France ne manquera pas non plus à sa responsabilité. J'en ai pris l'engagement. La présidence française du Conseil de l'Union européenne a fait de la lutte contre toutes les discriminations l'une de ses priorités et réaffirmera la spécificité, l'unicité de l'antisémitisme. La Commission européenne a présenté en octobre dernier, et je sais que sa présidente y reviendra dans quelques instants, une stratégie sur la lutte contre l'antisémitisme et la promotion de la vie juive. Création d'un réseau de signaleurs de confiance afin de supprimer les discours haineux en ligne, financement pour protéger les espaces publics et les lieux de culte, soutien à l'éducation, à la recherche et à la mémoire de la Shoah. La présidence française soutiendra activement cette stratégie dans toutes ses dimensions et travaillera à son endossement par tous les États membres. Mais cette lutte du quotidien passe également par l'adoption d'outils législatifs. La législation sur les services numériques sera un outil central de la lutte contre tous les propos haineux et antisémites sur les réseaux sociaux. Le Parlement européen s'est prononcé la semaine dernière sur ce texte nécessaire et la présidence française s'emploiera à ce que les négociations progressent le plus vite possible afin qu'ils puissent être le plus rapidement mis en œuvre. Enfin, au-delà de notre action au plan international et en Europe, nous continuerons à agir avec détermination au plan national. Nous poursuivrons les actions engagées et je pense en particulier à l'accompagnement de nombreux projets éducatifs, à l'augmentation du budget des institutions mémorielles et au soutien aux projets des partenaires associatifs, culturels, mémoriels, engagés dans la lutte contre la haine. En outre, nous avons agi pour dissoudre les associations ou les groupes qui faisaient l'apologie de l'intolérance et de la discrimination. C'est aussi cela, très concrètement, combattre la haine dans notre République. Je veux ici vous remercier pour votre mobilisation. Vous assurer que vous pourrez compter sur ma pleine vigilance, sur mon exigence, sur mon engagement à vos côtés. Le combat qui est le vôtre et qui est le nôtre est un combat essentiel à la civilisation européenne, à l'Union européenne comme construction politique et à la France comme nation et comme république. C'est un combat pour ne pas répéter les atrocités du passé. C'est un combat pour la dignité de chacune et de chacun. Ce combat, malheureusement, est redevenu d'actualité, car les vents mauvais ressoufflent, car des discours politiques s'installent, car des falsifications de l'histoire sont là à nouveau, car des actes au quotidien sont là pour nous rappeler que nous n'avons pas fini ce combat. Nous n'y céderons rien. Je compte sur vous et vous pouvez compter sur moi.
Alors, après le président de la République française, je vous propose d'écouter à présent un message délivré par la présidente de la Commission européenne, Madame Ursula von der Leyen.
Distinguished guests, members of the Jewish community, earlier this month I joined President Macron in the Panthéon in Paris to honor two founding figures of the European Union, Jean Monnet and Simone Veil. When Simone Veil was just 16, she was arrested and sent to Auschwitz because she was Jewish. She survived Auschwitz. And then in the winter of 1945, she was sent on a death march to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Again, she survived. After the war, she dedicated her life to public service in France and to building a more just and humane world. She cared deeply for human rights and the rights of women. Simone Veil became the first president of the European Parliament. And having witnessed Europe's darkest hour, she helped build our future as a founding mother of the European Union. Today, we remember all those who survived and the millions who perished in the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism dehumanizes the Jewish people. It strips individuals of their rights and dignity. In Nazi Germany, the dehumanization opened the door to the Shoah. We must never forget. To remember is to make a stand to defend human dignity everywhere. So today we also look to the future. After the war, Europe was built upon the promise of peace, of putting an end to hatred and ignorance. But anti-Semitism is again on the rise. It threatens Jewish communities in Europe. And this is why I presented the Commission's first ever strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life in Europe. Because Jewish life is an integral part of Europe's history and of Europe's future. And this is what Simone Veil fought for: the uncompromising defense of human dignity, reason, and moderation. I still remember her powerful speech to the German Bundestag on a Holocaust Remembrance Day almost 20 years ago. An entire country paused to listen to her words. She made us face the crimes, the horror, and the death of humanity. A past that would never get past her. She called on future generations to keep the memory alive. As she said, parce que les jeunes auront la responsabilité de faire échec à tout ce qui pourrait conduire au même engrenage de la haine et de la violence. End of quote. If we protect the facts, we can break the cycle of hatred and violence. Europe will remain united in diversity, faithful to the values of its founding fathers and mothers. You can always count on the European Commission to stand by your side.
Message à présent de Charles Michel, qui est le président du Conseil de l'Union européenne.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, today's commemoration marks the 77th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. The Shoah itself a methodical enterprise of extermination of the European Jewish people began more than 80 years ago. The monstrous realization of a plan, an ideology of hatred, of which we are gradually approaching the centenary. Every year, we see the last survivors of this abomination leave us. Soon, no one will remain to bear witness. With each passing year, the Shoah inches towards a historical event more and more distant, more and more abstract, especially in the eyes of the younger generations of Europeans. That's why, paradoxically, the more the years go by, the more important the commemoration becomes, the more essential. 2 years ago, during the international commemoration at the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, I was deeply moved by a survivor of the death marches. His name is Marian Turski. He addressed his granddaughter and all the young people, tired of hearing about Auschwitz, about the war, about the Holocaust. And he said, Auschwitz did not fall from the sky. It came in small steps. It entered amid the indifference and the discrimination against the rights of minorities. And what happened once can happen again. Marian Turski's powerful message to the young people, don't be indifferent, because if you are not careful, another Auschwitz could fall from the sky. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, today the lessons of the Shoah are more relevant than ever. First, because Jewish people feel threatened, and they are threatened. They are even attacked in Europe just because they are Jewish. We do not accept this. We'll never accept it. It cannot be repeated enough. Europe would not be what it is today without Jewish people. And Europe without Jewish people would no longer be Europe. Second, I want to extend Marian Turski's message to the young. Democracy, too, does not just fall from the sky. It's conquered, it's built. Democracy must be nurtured and protected day after day. It's not a given that it will last forever. Today, once again, democracy has its enemies. And they resemble the enemies of yesterday, of 80 years ago. Hate speech, extremism, rejection of the other, conspiracy theories. They creep into our societies. They infiltrate our lives. They contaminate our social networks. That's why today we must do more than remember. Remembering, unfortunately, is not enough. We must act, and the European Union is acting. We are fighting these enemies of democracy and fundamental values. But this must also be a personal fight, the fight of each and every one of us. And it begins by rejecting silence, by rejecting acceptance, by rejecting the small steps that lead to indifference. Because to be indifferent to hate speech and to discrimination is to be indifferent to humanity, indifferent to democracy. And this we must never be. Thank you.
"95 years ago, on the 27th January, Tsipora Favlovich was born in a village in modern-day Romania. She lived a happy childhood, but everything changed when, along with her classmates, she was forced out of school at the age of 14. Her crime? Being Jewish. The following years would be marked by fear, with the introduction of further legislation persecuting the Jewish community. Tsipora and her family retreated into hiding. Then, fear was matched by harrowing brutality when they were sent to Auschwitz in 1944. Tsipora would be one of the very few survivors, while her family were among the millions that were ruthlessly murdered behind wretched iron gates. It has been 77 years since the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp, and remembrance of the horrors of the Holocaust is still today also important. Despite decades of effort, we have not yet done enough to combat discrimination, to fight anti-Semitism, Fear still exists because anti-Semitism still exists, and because the fundamental right to be free from discrimination, irrespective of gender, race, ethnic origin or sexual orientation, is threatened daily. Too often we hear of attacks or plots to attack synagogues. Too many live in fear. In recent years, we have seen an escalation of anti-Semitic conspiracy myths. Disinformation and violence against communities move seamlessly between the online and offline world. Fear is present because the threat remains, and this is our collective failure. We must do more to make every citizen in Europe feel safe. Everyone must be free to believe whatever they want to believe, and to be whoever they want to be. This is the essence of our Europe. Our generation has a sacred responsibility to teach the lessons of history and to remind our youth of how low humanity was allowed to sink. The moment we stop talking about the Holocaust is the moment we allow the remembrance of such horrors to fade away. Don't stop talking about the Holocaust, because if we don't speak about it, there will be enough Holocaust deniers after us. That is Tsipora's message to us. The 27th of January marks an obligation for all of us to remember. This is our collective responsibility. Simone Weil, Auschwitz inmate 78651, became the first president of a directly elected European Parliament. The European Parliament's responsibility to remember is institutional, but it is also very personal. Today, we remember the atrocities committed towards the Jewish people and all the victims of the Holocaust. And we commemorate the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, a liberation that signaled that there was still hope. The European Parliament will not fail to condemn resurging anti-Semitism. The European Parliament will continue to uphold our European values and fundamental human rights to bring an end to discrimination. This is our collective challenge. We will never forget. We will keep fighting. This is the European Parliament's pledge to you.
Alors on écoute à présent le président du Congrès juif européen qui est donc à l'origine de cette édition spéciale. Il s'agit du docteur Moshe Kantor.
Dear President Macron, dear President Michel, dear President von der Leyen, dear President Metsola, dear Vice President Skinas, my dear friend Francis Khalifa, President of CRIF, dear Holocaust survivors, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends. Thank you for joining us for this commemoration of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today we mark the 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the ultimate Nazi factory of death. On the 20th of January, we also marked 80 years since the Wannsee Conference. On that fateful day, the final solution for the extermination of Jewish children, women and men was set in motion. The Nazis had tested humanity's reaction to violent anti-Semitism twice before. First, on Kristallnacht, where 267 synagogues were destroyed and over 7,000 Jewish businesses were attacked. People saw their Jewish neighbors lose everything in one night, and nobody protested then. Second, by the tragedy of St. Louis, a ship full of Jewish refugees that sailed out of Nazi Germany. Not only one country was willing to take the refugees in, and the St. Louis was forced to sail back to Hamburg. After the St. Louis, it became clear that governments were not going to move one finger to prevent the extermination of the Jews. Having made certain of the world's indifference, the Nazis set out to build a machine of destruction to exterminate entire Jewish people. Most of the participants of the Wannsee Conference, the perpetrators of history's most infamous crime, paid for their deeds. And this is the lesson. Adolf Eichmann was hanged for his crime, while Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated. Others were also hanged, jailed, or committed suicide. Only calamity, shame, and eternal curse await those who follow the path of extremism. Every year, Europe's Jewish communities pay tribute to the memory of the victims of the Shoah by shining light on different aspects of this darkest period of our history. This year we have chosen to place particular focus on France. About 75,000 Jews were deported from France to Nazi concentration camps and death camps, including 986 men and women and 324 children who were sent from Drancy to Auschwitz on Convoy 77, the last large convoy of Jewish deportees in July 1944. The Vichy authorities, their police and militias, brought French Jews to French camps to be sent for extermination later. At the same time, thanks to brave and heroic acts of many righteous French, almost 3/4 of French Jews survived the Holocaust. The liberators of France, de Gaulle, and the resistance were France, but Vichy was France too. This year, the French Republic is holding the presidency of the Council of the European Union. We are delighted that the French presidency is partnering with the European Jewish Congress for this very event. I do believe that France, as home of Europe's largest Jewish community, has a vital role to play in efforts across the EU to promote the memory of the Holocaust, combat anti-Semitism, and secure the continuation of Jewish life in Europe. We have already seen a brilliant commitment from President Macron to implement the EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life over the next 3 EU presidencies, and to develop new tools to ensure that our democratic freedoms live on. We have very high expectations on the French presidency, and we look forward to significant achievements. We owe it to the victims, and we owe it to survivors. We owe it to future generations. I do believe that the lesson of the darkest period of our European history are extremely relevant in the current situation. The Holocaust didn't begin with extermination camps or Nazi camps going village by village, wiping out entire Jewish communities. It began with blaming and dishonoring Jews. And as we know all too well, it ended with the destruction of Europe. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, and about 60 million Europeans died in World War II. In times of political and economic uncertainty, people look for simplistic solutions to questions for which they do not have answers. It is no accident that in the midst of pandemic, extremists are spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories about Jews or the State of Israel. This shows us that we cannot rest for 1 minute as they seek to poison the minds of young people. 2022 has been designated by European Union as European Year of Youth. Governments and civil society need to focus urgently on preventing young people from falling into extremism and radicalization. Never in recent times has a younger generation been so intensively brainwashed with lies and fake news, and yet so alarmingly unaware of the facts of the Holocaust. Our challenge is firstly to give these young people hope that they have a secure economic future. This is the task of governments, and in financial terms, it will be an enormous investment. However, if we do not invest in the future of our youth, the cost to our societies will be much greater in the long term. Neither should we pretend that this will be enough by itself. This is why we must look for the most relevant influencers who have trust and confidence of the young people. Those of their own age and background, those they look up to in the worlds of sports, entertainment, and politics. We can use the same tools that are being used to promote hate and extremism, primitive populism, and conspiracy theories, not as a force for evil, but as a force for good. We cannot win the fight against anti-Semitism without winning the fight against extremism in general. And I do thank all of you who are devoted to implementing this important mission. Thank you.
Survivants rescapés de la Shoah qui sont malheureusement, on le sait, chaque année de moins en moins nombreux. C'est pour ça qu'il est important de les entendre.
Daniel Urbechtel, j'ai 89 ans, et j'ai fait partie du dernier convoi qui est parti de Drancy pour l'Est le 31 juillet 1944. Et je suis arrivé à Auschwitz sans en avoir entendu parler au préalable.
Je m'appelle Frania Averlan. Je suis née en Pologne en 1926. J'étais arrêtée en 1939, 2 ghettos, 4 camps de concentration, libérés le 8 mai 1945. Je suis la seule survivante de toute ma famille.
Je m'appelle Victor Peraya. Je suis né à Paris le 4 avril 1933. J'ai été arrêté avec mes parents en 1942 et après un long séjour à Drancy, j'ai été déporté à Bergen-Belsen.
Yvette Lévy, je suis née à Paris en juin 1926. J'ai vécu toute la guerre à Paris et arrêté en guise de représailles par le commandant du camp de Drancy, Aloïs Brunner, dans la nuit du 21 au 22 juillet 1944. Nous avons mis 3 jours et 3 nuits pour arriver à Birkenau.
Je m'appelle Julia Valac. J'ai été arrêtée le 24 avril 1943 par dénonciation. Je suis arrivée au camp 2 mois après, à Birkenau-Auschwitz, le 26 juin 1943. Après, on m'a mis à Auschwitz. Et après, il y a eu la route de l'amour. Voilà.
Bien, je m'appelle donc Élie Buzyn. Je suis né le 7 janvier 1929 en Pologne, à Lodz. Mes parents ont été assassinés sauvagement dans les chambres à gaz et incinérés dans les fours crématoires de Birkenau. Voilà.
Je m'appelle Francine Christophe. Je suis née en 1933. J'ai été arrêtée à la ligne de démarcation le 26 juillet 1942. Alors, étant fille de prisonnier de guerre, j'étais protégée par la Convention de Genève. Ce qui fait qu'au lieu d'être déporté dans un camp d'extermination, j'ai été déporté dans un camp de concentration. Voilà pourquoi je suis encore en vie.
Nous, les derniers survivants de la Shoah, nous qui avons connu l'internement et la déportation,
la violence et l'humiliation,
le froid et la faim.
Nous qui avons côtoyé la mort.
Aujourd'hui, nous prenons la parole afin de témoigner une fois encore des conséquences de la barbarie,
de l'intolérance
et de l'antisémitisme.
À l'heure où les extrémismes gagnent partout du terrain,
jusqu'à notre dernier souffle, nous vous demandons de transmettre notre histoire,
de la défendre contre toute tentative de banalisation
ou de négation,
de rapporter nos paroles et de dire le nom de nos camarades disparus.
Demain, nous comptons sur vous pour ne rien laisser passer,
pour vous élever contre toute forme d'antisémitisme,
de racisme et contre tous les génocides.
La vigilance n'est pas un vain mot.
Restons vigilants.
Alors, nous sommes à présent en duplex avec Margaritis Schinas, qui est vice-président de la Commission européenne, chargée plus spécialement de la question de la lutte contre l'antisémitisme. Bonjour, Margaritis Schinas. La Commission européenne vient de mettre au point un document stratégique visant justement à lutter contre l'antisémitisme et promouvoir la vie juive en Europe, l'éducation, la recherche et la mémoire de l'Holocauste. Quel impact attendez-vous de ce document stratégique et quelles mesures concrètes envisage justement la Commission européenne ?
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de remercier le Congrès juif européen, la présidence française du Conseil et le Conseil représentatif des institutions juives de France pour l'organisation de cet événement. La journée internationale dédiée à la mémoire des victimes de l'Holocauste est un moment pour honorer le souvenir des millions de Juifs qui ont souffert et péri sous le régime nazi, comme il est de notre devoir solennel. C'est également un moment où nous devons réfléchir à ce que nous pouvons faire pour que de tels horreurs ne se reproduisent jamais plus. Le 5 octobre dernier, j'ai eu l'honneur effectivement de présenter la toute première stratégie européenne de lutte contre l'antisémitisme et la promotion et le soutien à la vie juive. Avec cette stratégie, nous marquons un tournant en Europe. C'est notre promesse d'un avenir pour la vie juive en Europe. Plusieurs générations après la fin de la Shoah, nous voyons avec inquiétude une hausse de l'antisémitisme en Europe. L'antisémitisme est incompatible avec un autre mode de vie européen, avec nos valeurs fondamentales. C'est pourquoi, au sein de cette commission, nous avons décidé d'intensifier considérablement la lutte contre l'antisémitisme. L'éducation reste et restera le moyen le plus précieux pour faire barrage aux préjugés et à la haine. Chaque enfant d'Europe devrait apprendre c'est ce qu'a été l'Holocauste, c'est ce que c'est la vie juive et c'est ce que c'est l'antisémitisme. Nous sommes déterminés à préserver et honorer l'héritage des survivants en veillant à ce que leur histoire ne tombe pas dans l'oubli et à ce qu'elle soit racontée et transmise avec exactitude. La recherche sur tous les aspects de l'Holocauste doit être menée librement, ouvertement et indépendamment afin de bien comprendre comment l'Holocauste a pu être possible en Europe. Il est également urgent d'identifier de nouveaux moyens pour faire mémoire, car les derniers survivants sont malheureusement en train de disparaître. Avec notre stratégie, nous proposons donc une série d'actions concrètes pour faire en sorte que la mémoire de l'Holocauste, la recherche et l'éducation soient assurées. Nous soutiendrons la création d'un réseau de sites là où l'Holocauste se produit, des synagogues aux sites culturels, des cache au champ de tir. Nous voulons rendre ce lieu visible. Cela permettra à chacun de retracer la continuité de la présence juive en Europe et facilitera les initiatives locales de visite et de restauration de ce site culturel et commémoratif. Et grâce à notre programme sur la citoyenneté, l'égalité, les droits et les valeurs, nous avons considérablement augmenté notre financement pour le projet pour la mémoire de l'Holocauste. L'appel pour cette année 2022 est ouvert jusqu'au 24 mars, avec 8 millions d'euros disponibles. Nous continuerons également à financer des projets de recherche sur l'Holocauste via notre programme de recherche Horizon Europe. Un dernier exemple, dans la mesure où les chaires universitaires sur l'antisémitisme et l'histoire juive dans l'Union européenne ne sont que peu connectées, nous avons décidé de créer un centre européen de recherche sur l'antisémitisme contemporain, afin de renforcer et de compléter la recherche liée à l'Holocauste.
Alors, nous savons que la lutte contre l'antisémitisme représente l'un des défis importants de la démocratie en Europe actuellement, avec tout ce que l'on voit, notamment à l'occasion de la pandémie de coronavirus, les phénomènes conspirationnistes qui utilisent beaucoup d'ailleurs des symboles liés à l'Holocauste. Comment est-ce que la Commission européenne veut surmonter ces défis?
Allow me to reply to this question in English for the many non-Francophone friends who are following us today. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown how old anti-Semitic prejudice can resurge and fuel new conspiracy myths and hatred, both online and offline. The comparison of pandemic measures with policies that led to the genocide of the Jewish people minimizes and trivializes the experiences of Holocaust victims and survivors. This is unacceptable. These comparisons to the Holocaust are damaging to historical truth. They dilute the understanding of the specificity of the Holocaust. Holocaust distortion, if left unchallenged, nourishes anti-Semitism, polarizes and creates dangerous forms of nationalism. This constitutes a threat to our democracies. And as history has unfortunately taught us, we should not take our democracies for granted. We have a strong tool to fight this through legal instruments. Hate speech relating to the condoning, denial, or gross trivialization of the Holocaust is criminalized at the EU level under the 2008 Framework Decision on combating racism and xenophobia. All member states are obliged to include this prohibition in their national legislation, and most member states have done so. But the Commission has been obliged to launch infringement procedures against some of the member states that failed to transpose correctly this law into their national legislation. We are counting on their full cooperation to remedy these deficiencies. In addition, we will continue to support and strengthen the awareness-raising campaign on countering Holocaust distortion with a #Protect the Facts campaign, together with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the United Nations, and UNESCO. Everyone can join this campaign on social media and take an active part in countering Holocaust distortion. I strongly encourage all of your viewers to do so. This dark part of our history concerns us all and can only be countered if we hear and share the truth of what happened.
Alors on va parler de l'avenir maintenant, Margaritis Schinas. La Commission européenne veut permettre aux jeunes Européens de perpétuer cette mémoire de l'Holocauste. Comment les sensibiliser, notamment face à la menace que représente l'antisémitisme?
To shape Europe's future, young Europeans need to understand their past. It is our duty and commitment to ensure that every European child learned the lessons of the Holocaust. With our strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, we committed not only to teaching young generations about the Holocaust, as I was referring earlier, but also about the Jewish contribution to European societies. Because this is essential to understand anti-Semitism and being able to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Currently, less than half of Europeans think the Holocaust is sufficiently taught in our schools. And this year, 2022, is the European Year of the Youth. And as part of these celebrations, we will be supporting the development of a network of young European ambassadors to promote Holocaust remembrance in schools, universities, and vocational and training institutions. Teachers will also be empowered to address the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. We will support their educational professional training together with UNESCO and the OSCE during the 2023-2024 period. We, here in the European Commission, can also support our member states to implement reforms in their school curricula to better tackle discrimination, intolerance, hatred, racism and anti-Semitism, and include Holocaust education as from primary school. We will also address anti-Semitism online. We are determined to work with the platforms, with industry and IT companies, and we will strengthen civil society organizations, trusted flaggers and fact-checkers. Finally, as a contribution to public awareness of the Shoah, we will, for the first time this year, illuminate our headquarters, the Berlaymont building, with a projection of We Remember on the Day of Holocaust Remembrance. This shows that the Commission takes a stand. We say never again, and we really mean it. And our strategy is the most tangible proof of our determination. It is our commitment to a future for Jewish life in Europe, for a Europe free from anti-Semitism and any form of discrimination, for an open, inclusive and equal society for all.
Alors, on va s'arrêter quelques instants sur les problématiques liées justement à la mémoire de la Shoah. On vit une période particulièrement troublée avec cette pandémie de coronavirus et la mémoire de la Shoah subit actuellement, notamment sur les réseaux sociaux, de très nombreuses attaques. Comment justement y remédier? On va y réfléchir avec trois invités qui sont avec nous depuis Paris. Je salue tout d'abord Manuel Valls, ancien Premier ministre français qui est avec nous. Bonjour Manuel Valls.
Bonjour.
Hello. Je salue juste à côté de vous Abnous Chalmani, qui est écrivaine, chroniqueuse, qu'on connaît bien évidemment sur I24 News. Bonjour Abnous.
Bonjour. Hello.
Et à côté de vous également Raphaël Enthoven, écrivain, qui est avec nous également. Bonjour à vous.
Bonjour. Merci de votre invitation. Thank you for inviting
Alors,
me.
on va justement essayer d'évoquer tous ensemble d'abord ce que représente aujourd'hui cette journée de commémoration de l'Holocauste, de la Shoah. Manuel Valls, quel est pour vous justement le rapport et le rôle que doit avoir une telle journée?
Au fond, comme toutes les journées de commémoration,
like any other Remembrance Day, it is a very important moment in time to remember the victims, their loved ones.
C'est un moment historique, celui de la libération du camp d'Auschwitz.
The liberation of the Auschwitz camp is a historical moment. And of course, like all of these Remembrance Days, it's an important day in the time we're living in today. History doesn't repeat itself, but it stumbles. We do see that there are troubles, a democratic crisis in all countries. Anti-Semitism is coming back in different forms, especially now with the pandemic, and anti-Semitism always announces great hardships. So we have to remember and to prepare ourselves again, politically and morally, to fight anti-Semitism.
Cet antisémitisme.
Abnous Chalmani, alors vous êtes d'origine iranienne. L'Iran, on sait que c'est un pays où on n'enseigne pas énormément, pour ne pas dire pas du tout d'ailleurs, la Shoah. Qu'est-ce que représente pour vous cette journée?
Alors, surtout en tant que Française que je vais réagir.
I'm going to answer as a French citizen because I arrived in France when I was 8 years old and I never returned to Iran. But I still have family living there and of course I have links with my home country. My story is very particular. As opposed to many Iranians, I discovered the Holocaust when I was young because my grandfather was Sufi and used to go to a bookstore. In 1958, he brought back a book that told the history of the Holocaust to my father, who was 10 years old. And I can tell you, I have been looking for this book for many years. So my grandfather was shaken, and he told the story to my father. And so it became like a family tradition. His father told him, and then my father told it to me too when I was 7 years old. There was a Jewish Iranian girl in my class, and she was bullied, and my father gave me the mission to take her defense. So the Holocaust became a part of our family story, and when I arrived in France, I chose to study history because I had to understand how I became an exile, an immigrant in France. Obviously, this was the typical story of a family troubled by history, and this has to do with all the movements in history that create immigrants. This tragedy touched me when I was a little girl, especially because I had to deal with Holocaust denial. And slowly but surely, anti-Semitism transformed into a misuse, an abuse. And we see it on social media. This is what Emmanuel Valls has said. Now, with the pandemic, we see yellow stars reappearing on social media. And it is a way of playing down the Holocaust. It has to do with Holocaust denial. But we have also seen in 2019, in the streets of Paris, Muslim protesters bearing the yellow star. So it's very important not only to remember, as Emmanuel said, but also to use all of our weapons to arm ourselves, because when anti-Semitism comes back, it announces a tragedy for humanity.
Alors évidemment, on va parler de ça, on va s'arrêter sur cette problématique que vous évoquez, c'est-à-dire notamment à l'occasion de cette pandémie de coronavirus, la manière avec laquelle sont détournés les symboles de la Shoah. Raphaël Enthoven, c'est pour vous le danger principal cette année sur lequel il faut mettre l'accent à l'occasion de cette journée ?
Alors oui, bien sûr. J'ajouterai une chose dans le sillage.
Yes, of course, but I would like to add something to what my colleagues have just said. I think it's essential to stop exploiting the Holocaust. The fact that some people dare to compare the situation of those who are against vaccination to the situation of the Jewish people during World War II is a red line that has been crossed. This is tragic because they believe they are right when they do so.
C'est-à-dire qu'un régime où chacun peut avoir le sentiment de détenir la vérité, c'est autorisé à franchir, ceci est tragique.
Abnoussa is absolutely right when she mentions the Muslims who protested against Islamophobia using the yellow star in November 2019. The misuse of the symbol is very serious, and it's not only shameful, it's also dangerous because it plays down the absolute crime and the issue, which is a collective issue, not just a community issue, is to stop exploiting the Holocaust, to go back to history as much as we can, and to convey what history tells us. We will talk later about how to do it, but this is the essential part. The essential thing here is the fact that the Holocaust is not a tool and that people don't have the right to use it. Nobody should abuse it.
Vous n'avez pas le droit de vous en servir. Nul n'a le droit de s'en servir.
Bon, et c'est quelque chose sur lequel on n'a pas d'emprise, hein, si on voit justement l'ampleur que cela prend aujourd'hui. Manuel Valls, justement, on a l'impression que le pouvoir politique, le pouvoir législatif, se montre assez impuissant finalement à empêcher à chaque fois qu'on utilise ces symboles de la Shoah, qu'on utilise ces comparaisons absolument honteuses, quels que soient finalement les sujets. Là, c'est le coronavirus ou le pass vaccinal, mais ça pourrait être autre chose. Pourquoi est-ce que le pouvoir politique semble impuissant justement à empêcher cela ?
Ça pourrait être autre chose, évidemment, mais
Yes, it could be any other context, but paradoxically, when I was young, I used to live in the 4th neighborhood of Paris. I went to a primary school, which was located in front of the memorial of the unknown Jewish martyr, but no one mentioned the Holocaust at school. The first time I heard about it was on TV, in a wonderful series called Holocaust. I also remember another film that was shown a few years before when I was in high school.
Avait été diffusé quelques années auparavant. Je me rappelle du choc au ciné-club de mon lycée. Aujourd'hui, il y a des...
And since then, we do have Holocaust survivors who come to share the story of the Holocaust with children. The laws regarding the denial of the Holocaust are quite severe, so our society has done things about it during the last few years.
Ces 20 dernières années, il y a eu un mouvement de reprise de l'antisémitisme, essentiellement venant
But in the last 20 years, there has been a movement that has made a comeback of the anti-Semitism, together with Islamism and the far left. We can see that in our country, and this movement led to terror attacks. We heard people chanting "Death to the Jews" in Paris in 2014. We have seen people who died.
L'islam politique, l'islamisme, d'ailleurs, a commis une alliance.
Political Islamism has made an alliance with the far right and the far left, and anti-Semitism has become the ideological base of Islamism. And once again, Jews were murdered again. French Jews were murdered just because they were Jews.
Donc, on a changé de paradigme d'une certaine manière.
So we have to fight at every level, political and legislative, of course. We should not stop and we should not be too indulgent, but we have to rally the whole society.
This is what I wanted to say.
It's not acceptable, and you're absolutely right. Exploiting and abusing these symbols morally has to be fought at the political level as well.
And I would like to add that the law is not enough.
Parce que la loi n'y suffit pas.
Exactement.
La loi n'y suffit
Exactly.
pas. C'est à l'ancien Premier ministre que je le dis, vous le savez mieux que nous.
The law is not enough. You have been Prime Minister. You know better than us that the law cannot solve all the problems related to anti-Semitism. For instance, when René Chiche, who is a philosophy professor, says for the first time since the laws for the Jews from 1940s, citizens who didn't violate any law are punished and can't have access to some places just because they're not vaccinated, it's a step towards hell. When someone writes such nonsense, a man who teaches philosophy makes such an analogy, it is totally crazy. He is still within the framework of the law, and the law cannot punish this. This is not reprehensible from a legal point of view, but we have to fight this, ideologically speaking, and by teaching people. Emmanuel is absolutely right. The entire society has to be involved. In France, certain things are defended by law and fought against by citizens, and the other way around. In this case, it's the same. To fight anti-Semitism, we must use education. So the law is not enough. That's quite right.
Yes, the law is not enough. There is a cultural movement which is there in the relativization of the Holocaust. This idea of white privilege that comes from the United States. I want to remind you that the Jewish community represents 2% of the population in the U.S. And according to FBI statistics from 2020, half of the crimes related to religion are perpetrated against Jews, which is huge. Nowadays, we only consider things through a victim context. And Jews are white, so they are considered as being part of white privilege. So the law is not enough. And we need to use teaching. So the law is not enough. And we need to use teaching and pedagogy to fight that.
Yes, it's a scandal. People talk about Judaism and the whites.
Exactly. But people forget that there are Ethiopian Jews. Miss Israel is a black woman, but that doesn't concern anyone. Nobody remembers that. People just remember the conflict with Palestinians, and we have seen activists beating Jewish people in the streets of New York. It's crazy. I was very shocked by something that happened. Dave Chappelle, an American comedian who is very talented and who won several Emmy Awards, converted to Islam. In October, half of the employees at Netflix went on a strike because they considered his show transphobic. So I decided to have a look to form an opinion. And I didn't think that the show was transphobic, but it was definitely anti-Semitic.
Really? I didn't watch it.
For instance, Dave Chappelle says that he is going to direct a film about very ancient people who decide to leave Earth and to go and live on another planet. When they arrive there, they are not treated well and go through horrible things. So they come back to Earth. And they call the place, quote, Space Jew. And then you hear someone from the audience who says, quote, Free Palestine. Apart from Jewish media, no media, nor The Guardian, nor the New York Times, mentioned this sequence that is so anti-Semitic. And there are no complaints. After 10 days on Netflix, there were 10 million views, and there was a satisfaction rate of 43% from film critics and 95% from the audience. So in the newspapers, there was no warning that this program was full of anti-Semitic sequences. And that's how anti-Semitism became something normal, something usual. So in the mind of people who always consider themselves as victims, Jews are too successful. For these people, the Jews don't exist, and this is what we have to fight. And that's why it's much more complicated than to simply sue someone in front of a court, to give the person a fine, or to tell him that he does something wrong. I have the feeling that today this issue is raised in the comedy shows, in the movies. The image of the successful and dangerous Jew is back, so this Jew is dominant. And as a matter of fact, he oppresses others. And amongst the people who think that Israel is a colonizing country and a state of apartheid, there are lots of people from left political parties who are very happy with this vision.
I couldn't agree more. And that's the reason why I think we must also fight regarding fictions. We must also fight on the educational level. We must have discussions to teach the people about the transmission of a memory, of a story, a memory which is a collective one. I say it again, it's the duty of everybody.
You are right, but I think that politicians must stop offering their condolences to the Jewish community after every terror attack targeting Jews. They should offer their condolences to the national community. We see it in their speeches. They make a difference between the people and the Jewish people.
It goes even beyond that. I saw a tweet from Eric Zemmour mentioning the innocent French people. He's using the words of former French Prime Minister Raymond Barre, which means that he wants to say that there is, on one side, the foreign delinquents, and on the other side, the innocent French people. So we must fight on the educational level. We must know our history and understand what Zemmour means when he talks about innocent French people. So we have to lead this fight at this level. But I think that it is also important on the level of fiction, derision and humor.
Emmanuel nous donne son avis parce que c'est vrai qu'on parle des solutions, on cherche des solutions aujourd'hui. Bon, on a vu que la loi ne pourrait pas tout faire. Il y a aussi le problème de l'éducation, puisqu'on a vu que ce sont les jeunes générations qui sont de plus en plus touchées par cette espèce d'effacement aussi de ce qu'a été la tragédie de la Shoah. Comment aujourd'hui, Emmanuel Valls, on peut réfléchir à des solutions peut-être nouvelles pour relancer dans les esprits de ces jeunes qui aujourd'hui n'ont quasiment plus en face d'eux de survivants pour leur raconter ce qu'était la Shoah? Comment est-ce qu'on peut essayer de trouver de nouvelles solutions aujourd'hui?
D'abord, il faut poursuivre le combat politique. On évoquait un humoriste américain il y a un instant.
First, we must continue the political fight. We were mentioning an American comedian, and it reminds me of the fight I led against Dieudonné a few years ago. He was very popular, very appreciated, not only by the young people from the sensitive urban zones. At the beginning of the 2000s, he would perform in concert halls filled with all kinds of people. And the fact that he was so popular is the evidence that there was a problem. So the fight has to be political, legal, and we must fight double standards.
De deux poids, deux mesures. Comment Dieudonné ne peut pas tenir des propos antisémites, mais Charlie peut s'en prendre.
For instance, I remember that I used to hear young people complaining and saying things like, why can't Dieudonné make anti-Semitic remarks while Charlie Hebdo has the right to make fun of the Prophet Muhammad? This way of thinking is very dangerous.
Totale de mémoire. Donc ce combat, il est juridique et politique, il faut le mener. Après, c'est celui de la mobilisation. Parce que quand on a réussi à mettre à genoux Dieudonné et Soral, et d'autres, les antisémites,
most of the time, people who say that they don't really know history and have no memory. But we also have to mobilize people, because even if we were able to stop Dieudonné, Soral, and others, the anti-Semitism will find other ways. This is relativism, and relativism is harder to fight. What we have seen during the pandemic is appalling. In the beginning of the pandemic, Israel seemed to deal successfully with the virus. The population was mobilized and vaccinated before other countries in the world. But then people started making anti-Semitic remarks about that. People were almost saying, if Israel succeeds, it's maybe because Israel itself has spread the virus.
Et troisièmement, je pense que la culture, l'humour, la fiction, la littérature, les réseaux sociaux, la mobilisation, ce qui est fait, c'est-à-dire au fond cette bande
I think that culture, humor, fiction, literature, social media, and the mobilization are a kind of database to make us remember the horror of the Holocaust and to immortalize the memory.
L'horreur des camps. Et puis ne rien laisser passer quand il y a cette polémique terrible, affreuse, dégueulasse.
We must be inflexible.